Dr. Chip Taylor has trained as an insect ecologist. He's published papers on species assemblages. You'll understand why I have to read this, okay. On species assemblages, hybridization, reproductive biology, population dynamics, and plant demographics and pollination. Starting in 1974, Dr. Taylor established research sites and directed students studying neotropical African honeybees in French Guiana, Venezuela, and Mexico. In 1992, he founded Monarch Watch, which is probably why all of you are here tonight, an outreach program focused on education, research, and conservation of monarch butterflies. Since then, Monarch Watch has enlisted the help of many volunteers to tag monarchs during the fall migration. This program has produced many new insights into the dynamics of monarch migration. In 2005, Monarch Watch created the Monarch WAYSTATION program in recognition that habitats for monarchs are declining at a rate of 6,000 acres a day in the United States. The goal of this program is to inspire the public, schools, and others to create habitats for monarch butterflies and to assist Monarch Watch in educating the public about the decline in resources for monarchs, pollinators, and all wildlife that share the same habitats. So without further, Dr. Chip Taylor.
Thank you, Angela. Very nice to be here. Very nice of all of you to come out tonight. I presume that those of you in the back of the room are going to sleep and not see the slides, but if you really want to see the slides, come on up here a little bit closer. All right, how do I start this thing? I'm not thinking so. Do you hear the sound other than the music? You know what that sound is? Tens and tens of thousands of monarch butterflies flying. That's the sound that those wings make. And it is just an extraordinary sound, the kind of sound that you won't hear anywhere else on the planet, because there is nowhere else on the planet where that many butterflies gather in one place or come off trees in that manner. What you're looking at is a cascade. We call it a cascade of butterflies coming off the trees. They're clustered in incredible densities on these oyamel fir trees at these overwintering sites in Mexico. And when a cloud passes over, when a bird goes through, or for some other reason those colonies are disturbed and the temperature is right, this is the effect that you get. This was filmed by Louis Schwartzberg for a Disney production called Wings of Life. It was all about pollination, but it included this really nice section about monarch butterflies. And I was fortunate enough to work with Louis in this filming, and it was just an extraordinary experience. Louis is one of those people, that you should get to know a little bit, because he does some extraordinary film work. One of the things that he does almost every day of his life is stop action photography, so that when he plays it back, you can see a flower open slowly. I mean, it's just beautiful stuff. You can see a hummingbird come into a flower and so on. So you look up Wings of Life. But there's another thing that Louis did that I call upon several times a year. And that is that he has a video on YouTube. You could also see it on in some other places. It's called Gratitude. And it tells us why we all should be thankful in probably the nicest way that I have ever seen. And we should be thankful for these butterflies. And we should be thankful for this world that we inhabit and all of the things that we are blessed to experience. We have this fine food, we have this good comradeship, we have this wonderful venue, we have this wonderful Iowa winter. Well, hey, it's life, and we got to appreciate it for what it is. But anyway, look that up, Gratitude. It's a wonderful little video. And Louis done some really extraordinary work. But we should appreciate this butterfly for what it is as well. It's one of the world's most extraordinary natural phenomena. Here we have a butterfly that basically reproduces in the northern part of our continent, eastern northern part of the continent, over several generations each summer, then migrates to the overwintering sites in Mexico, where it spends 4.5, even 5 months, and then returns to start the cycle all over again. So there's a birth and death in this whole thing that is extraordinary and easy to see and easy to, not altogether easy to understand, but easy to see in a way that we can't see it for most of nature. The thing that we don't see for most of the wildlife out there is the death process. We might see the birth process. We might be able to get some sense of populations growing, but to get a sense of migration, population growth, population death, there's not much better out there than looking at the monarch butterfly. One of the most emotional experiences I've ever had with this butterfly was to go to these overwintering sites where these masses of butterflies occur. Went there on the 17th of November in 1997. There was a big monarch conference down there. I walk up into the forest with a bunch of companions as the colonies were just forming, 17th of November. We're looking up at these bags of butterflies hanging from the trees, and we're just marveling and talking among ourselves about this extraordinary feat that this butterfly does. We got butterflies that come from New Brunswick. We got butterflies that come from Winnipeg. We got butterflies that come from way north in Ontario and Quebec that reach these overwintering sites. Think about that. It's a 2.5 month journey to make it to these overwintering sites from wherever they originate. It's an extraordinary feat. And you talk about this and you look up there, as I was doing, and then I heard this little tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. Little tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. The understory. And I look at the understory, and there's a butterfly lying there with big wing damage. There's another one that's just flopping around, obviously near death. And I started looking, instead of up at the trees, I started looking at what was happening underneath those trees. And butterflies were dying underneath those trees within days of having made a 2.5 month journey to get there. What does that tell you? To me, you know, as a biologist, that's really, really emotional, because that tells you there's an extraordinary life force out there. This drive to replicate, which is in nearly all of life, is extraordinary. And you could see it with this butterfly. You could see it with these butterflies that were dying just after having arrived. Wow, that really connects you with what's going on. Really humbles you as to what's going on in nature in general. That you have this life and death process going on that we barely are aware of until you see something like that, until you understand the nature of the dynamic that created that, and the implications of the fact that so many of them are dying after having gotten there. Anyway, I'm connected with this butterfly in an extraordinary way. And I'm dedicated to monarch conservation as a result of that. And the story we're going to talk about tonight is really what needs to be done to save this migration, to keep on an even keel here, in spite of the fact that the world is changing around us, in spite of the fact that we have looming climate change, which threatens to upstage all of the things that we might do. I have been telling people that, those that care to listen, that the monarch really is not going to be with us very long unless we respond to climate change. We really have to deal with the fact that CO2 is increasing incrementally. I was online the other day and I saw some really naive comment about what the future is going to be like. And I was going to say to those people, I said, look, can you predict what the parts per million of CO2 are going to be next year? Because you can predict it. You can predict what's going to happen next year with CO2. All you have to do is look at what happened the year before and the year before that. And then you can see that if you project what CO2 is going to do next year and the year after that, you can project what it's going to be in 2030. You can project what it's going to be in 2040. You can project what it's going to be in 2050. And then you can say, what are the consequences of all that going to be? So we're looking at some really significant changes because we're doing very little to slow down CO2. And the consequences of not dealing with CO2 are going to doom monarch butterflies and a whole lot of other things. And I taught a course for a long time at the University of Kansas called The World of 2040, which we looked at a lot of these things. And it caused me to dedicate myself much more intensely to all sorts of conservation efforts, because we're going to lose a lot unless we pay attention to the long-term prospects. So if you ask around and look around and ask who is thinking about the future, you find that very few people are thinking about the future. Very few people are planning for what's going to be around in 2040. Very few people are paying attention, and certainly very few governments are paying attention. And it's the governments that are going to drive this thing, unless the public drives it. I don't know if you've heard about Greta. Anybody hear about Greta? So Greta is part of a youth movement to deal with climate change because it's going to be their future. And if you saw 60 Minutes last week, there is a lawsuit of children against the US government dealing with climate change. And nobody gave it the slightest bit of chance of being sustained, but it is still an active lawsuit. And what they're doing with this lawsuit is that they're using all the government's words to fight against the government. So the government has maintained that the climate change is real and has been going on for a long time, and this is the basis for arguing that the government really is responsible and must do something about climate change. It'll be interesting to see how this goes through. But mark my words, the things are going to change. There's going to be a people-led effort to deal with climate change because of things like monarch butterflies, because of things like losing the biodiversity that we depend on. So anyway, I hadn't intended on going off on this rant about this, but I'm given to preaching. My former department chair said, after one of our faculty meetings, he took me aside, he says, Chip, I heard you talking. I thought I was in church. All right, well, end of sermon for right now. Okay, let's go on. My talk, if I hit the right buttons, is Monarch Conservation All Hands on Deck. And what this means is that in order to save the monarch butterfly, and in order to save an awful lot of things that sustain us, we're really going to have to pay attention to a lot of the little things out there that we're ignoring right now. And that means, number one, climate change, but it also means that we have to pay attention to just the proximate conditions for dealing with the things that are being lost or diminished. One of the first things we have to understand is how much we're losing every year. And I go to meeting after meeting with my colleagues, and they talk about all of the different measures they're going to use for conservation of this, that, and the other thing. And unfortunately, I have to bring them back to reality now and then. I said, well, how much are you losing? Because unless you're paying attention to how much you're losing, you don't know what you really have to put into this in order to save it. So we'll talk a little bit about that with regard to monarchs. What do we have to do to keep from losing the monarch? What sort of pace do we have to maintain in terms of monarch conservation? What sort of reestablishment of habitats do we have to engage in order to sustain this species? So as you probably know, the butterflies overwinter in Mexico, as we talked about. They're moving north out of Mexico right now. Over the last week, they've started to move north. They will be arriving in Texas probably between the 10th and 12th of this month, and increasing numbers after the 12th. And they will arrive in pretty good numbers through the month of March, and then it will tail off as we get into April. There will still be butterflies coming to Texas in April, but it'll tail off a little bit. That area that is shown on the map that's kind of green is the area that is normally recolonized by the butterflies returning from Mexico. And by the time they get to the northern part of that green area, most of those butterflies, maybe not all of them, but most of them have died. And that is usually around the 1st of May. On the other hand, what they have done up until the 1st of May is that they have laid eggs. They have laid eggs in the milkweeds as they've been moving north. And laying eggs in that green area means that what they're doing is producing progeny that can then move north in May and the first week of June. And that's what happens. In May and the first week of June, you get this kind of second stage where the first generation of monarchs are moving north, recolonizing that entire yellow area to the north. Then you go through 2 to 3 additional generations. And with those additional generations, you then produce a fall population that goes into reproductive diapause. They're non-sexual, and they migrate southward in a non-sexual manner, arriving 2.5 months later at the overwintering sites. That whole migration starts in Winnipeg about the 5th to 10th of August each fall. All right, and then they progressively move down. So you kind of have a rolling migration that picks up new recruits as it continues to move south. So the migration starting north is relatively small because the population is not too terribly large up there. And then it picks up more and more individuals who join the migration. This thing moves down the continent, crosses the border between Del Rio and Eagle Pass, Texas. For the most part, that's about where 95% of the butterflies enter Mexico. They get into the mountains of Mexico. It takes them about another 2.5 weeks from crossing that border to get to the overwintering sites. They arrive at the overwintering sites in the last couple of days of October on most years, and just in time for the Day of the Dead, which, as you probably know, symbolizes the return of the souls of dead children to some of the people in Mexico. So the Day of the Dead is one of the big celebrations on the 2nd of November every year. So this is a cycle that's repeated every year, where these butterflies then overwinter for 4.5, 5 months, and then return again. So it's trying to understand this whole annual cycle, which at the one hand is all about reproduction once they get to the United States, and they reproduce from that period from March until really the end of September, and then a death period, which involves everything that goes on in the migration and through the overwintering sites. So you have a reproductive period that goes for about 5 months, and basically a mortality period that goes for about 7 months. They kind of overlap a little bit, but that gives you a rough idea of how the whole dynamic works. Now, one of the reasons that we're here tonight, probably the only significant reason that we're here, is that there's a tremendous concern about the continuation of this migration, because the migration has declined significantly since the early 1990s. You see some really large populations over there on the left side, and then the population began to decline. And there's been a lot of concern about why it declined and how it declined, and we'll get to all of that. But you can see that we reached a really low point in 2013, where the population was only 0.67 hectares. Now, we're dealing with a very unusual condition here in that, for most part, for all of life out there, it's very hard to count the numbers of individuals in any one population and kind of have a summary picture of the size of the population at any one time on any one annual cycle. But with these butterflies, we have this opportunity because probably 98% of them go to a few mountaintops in Mexico where they cluster on the trees, and people can go around and measure the total area of trees that are occupied by these butterflies, and then use that information to come up with a total area for all of the different clusters, all the different trees. And that's measured out in hectares, and in case you don't know, each hectare is 2.2 acres. So you can multiply any one of those numbers by 2.2 and you get the number of acres. So if you can see that population went way down in 2013, and that was alarming. It was so low that if we'd had a major mortality event that winter, chances are we still wouldn't be here. We'd be talking about how to bring that population back, but it would be infinitesimally small. All right, we wouldn't have had them in good numbers. The butterfly has tremendous reproductive capacity, but how it can bounce back is really limited by how good the resources are and what the weather allows. This butterfly is basically a temperature-dependent species. It's dependent on temperature for development of eggs, larvae, pupae, and adults. Its reproductive physiology is all temperature-dependent as well. And so everything that drives this species is keyed to temperature, but that's overlaid on this base, which is the resource base. So the resource can be there really in great abundance, and the population can go down if all of the temperature factors are really negative. And so at some level, the resource base is not as important as what the physical parameters are. And in other cases, the resource base itself is limiting, because if all of the physical factors are just absolutely prime, then the upper limit on the population is determined by how good the resources are. So you've got to get this balance in thinking about, the variation per year against a resource base, which in itself varies per year. All right, so let's think about the fact we had a very low population. That inspired the three governments, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, to become involved in monarch conservation in a big way. 20th of June 2014, President Obama issued a memorandum, which is very unusual, asking all 14 federal agencies that had something to do with property to become involved in monarch and pollinator conservation. That was an amazing thing to do, because the response of the agencies to this initiative, to this request by the president, was just enormous. The people in the agencies tell me that they've never seen agencies which tend to move extraordinarily slowly, as you probably know. Yeah, very slowly. I mean, snail's pace for almost everything. They jumped on it. They jumped on monarch conservation, and they all became really very rapidly engaged in monarch conservation. As a consequence of that, and working with U.S. Geological Survey, there were a whole series of meetings that were held to discuss what the particular problems are, what we might do about them, and how we could move forward, and who should be involved, and so on and so forth. So the first paper that came out of this was an extinction model paper, which basically said, well, what are the probabilities that we're going to lose this migration, it become extinct simply because the environment will not support it, because of mass mortality, because of loss of habitat, and so on and so forth. So the extinction model was pretty stark. It actually predicted that we could lose this migration pretty quickly. Then other things came out, which are the population model, from what we knew at that particular time. It was kind of a wishy-washy model in my estimation, but it was what we had to work with at that time. And then another model came out which said, we have to address the problem of how much habitat has been lost and what to do about that habitat loss. So what can we identify here? First of all, let's look at the resource base, which is the amount of milkweed that's out there. And then let's look at the amount of milkweed that used to be out there and ask, what do we have to replace? Well, the answer to that question was that we have to replace about 1.4 billion stems. Billion. I can't even count to 4 some days. And they're talking about billion, all right? So, so you say billion, how are we going to do that? Where are we going to do that? How many acres are going to be involved? We're talking about 20 million acres. And that comes back to the title of my talk, which is All Hands on Deck. That was the All Hands on Deck paper. All right, and All Hands on Deck means that virtually every sector out there, from you folks to the right-of-ways, to the highway departments, to the landowners in general, to the corporations, to the businesses, that everybody who controls some landscape, who can do something along the line of providing nectar plants and milkweeds, has got to become involved, because that's the only way we're going to save this migration, particularly in the face of a changing climate. All right, so those are the targets. 1.4 billion plants, all hands on deck, 20 million acres. How are we going to do it? All right, that's where we're at. All hands on deck. How are we going to do all of that? Well, let's talk about something else first, because you guys are in Iowa are very much involved in my tagging program. And I've been running a tagging program since 1992. And that tagging program has yielded a tremendous number of results that are just now being published. We turned in a paper last week. We're going to turn in another paper very shortly. And 2 or 3 more papers are going to be coming after that very quickly, we hope, describing the results of this tagging program. And Iowa plays a key role in this program, because it is in Iowa, in this central part of the state, including a little bit of southern Minnesota, a little bit of Wisconsin and Illinois, that we have the highest rate of tagging, and we have the clearest indication that the tagging is correlated with the overwintering numbers. In other words, what you see here in Iowa is what we see in Mexico months later. Now, isn't that cool? Because we can't say that for any other part of the country. We really can't. So you folks have the front seat. You have you have the captain's chair in terms of seeing what's going to happen to this population in the future, because it all comes through here. If this population goes down, you're going to know it. If the population goes up, you're going to know it. And you're probably going to have a role in it, positive or negative, depending upon what you do in this state. Because this is a key state. This is a key central area to this migration. All right, monarch tagging. This is how they're tagged. Circular tag, very special adhesive, hind wing, underside on the discal cell, close to the center of lift and center of gravity for the butterfly. And those tags stay on well, and we have armies of people doing this, including guys like this, the wild tigers of West Lawrence or wherever they are. Or anyway, that looks like Japanese or Chinese on that shirt, but no, I don't think they're tagging there. Although I did, oh, you know what? I did get a call from a woman in Oklahoma once, and she said, you know what? I found this dead butterfly right alongside my driveway, and it was just absolutely beautiful and perfect. And I picked it up and I turned it over and I saw this tag and I said, oh my God, made in China. That's the first thing she's thought of when she saw that tag, like on the bottom of a cup. All right. No, they're not making monarch butterflies in China, not yet. All right, well, this shows you the distribution of a lot of our taggers. And there are places where we have things really well covered, and then places where we should have a little bit more in the way of tagging in the eastern part of the Dakotas and western Minnesota and so on and so forth. But we've got a lot of coverage for the tagging. So it's pretty well represented, and it turns out that tagging in general represents the overwintering numbers quite well. All right, down in Mexico, the tags are recovered by the local residents. They sometimes show up with enormous numbers of tags if we've had a big winter kill down there. And this kind of summarizes the total number of tags that have been applied. 1.6 million butterflies tagged, about 16,000 recovered. And since we've been using the circular tags, and from 98 through 2015, we have about 1.3 million tagged and 13,000 recovered, and so on and so forth. We have a little difference between the recovery rates of wild butterflies and reared, tagged, and released butterflies. We're going to be writing a paper on that, so we make a distinction between wild and reared. It's pretty important. Now here you can see that what this particular figure shows, those yellow lines should be a little darker so you can see them, but they represent the longitudes. So the most eastern section of the country is set off by 80 west. That runs through western Pennsylvania. And then from 80 to 90, that goes through from western Pennsylvania to just west of Madison, Wisconsin. And from just west of Madison, Wisconsin, we run out to the middle of the Dakotas. And so we break out the country in these 5x5s by latitude and longitude. And what you can see here is that if you look at the black dots, if you can see them from that far away, we have a tremendous number of black dots right in this Iowa 5x5, right? That's a hot spot. You're a hot spot here for monarch recoveries. Butterflies tagged here in Iowa have a better chance of getting to Mexico than just about any place else, which is cool. Keep on tagging, folks. We love it. All right. So here's a very simple breakdown of this. It doesn't tell us a whole lot, but it tells us some pretty fundamental things that we can chew on. Look what happens from 80 to 65. Only 9% of those butterflies are recovered in Mexico. And then if we go from 80 to 90, which is western Pennsylvania, to just west of Madison, Wisconsin, it's 19%. And then if we add these two together for the western portion here, you end up with 71% of the butterflies, but only 42% of the tagged butterflies represent 71% of the recoveries. So there's a tremendous difference on the basis of origin for butterflies that get to Mexico. So if you were originating in the Northeast, your chances of getting to Mexico are really quite a bit lower. And earlier we had a discussion in the earlier session about why that should be so. Well, the distance is not quite twice as far if you go from Newfoundland to, say, Del Rio, Texas. Not Newfoundland, New Brunswick, to Del Rio, Texas. It's about 2,000 miles. If you go from, say, northern Minnesota to Del Rio, Texas, that's about 1,100 miles. But one of the things that we understand about this migration, or think we do, is that this migration is initiated by celestial changes. And the butterflies basically are starting the migration at the same time across all of these longitudes. So let's just take two butterflies. Let's take a butterfly that originates in the upper Midwest and a butterfly that originates in New Brunswick, and say, all right, if you're both starting on the same day and you're both moving at the same pace, how long is it going to take you to get to Del Rio, Texas? Well, the butterflies that come out of the Midwest only take about 42 days to get to Del Rio, Texas. Moving at a steady pace, say 27 miles a day, but the butterflies coming out of New Brunswick would take about 82 days to get there. So being on the road more than twice as long is going to be full of hazards. So you either have to fly faster if you're from the east, which means that you'd have to feed more, you'd have to be in flight more, you'd have to rest less, right? So it's tough to make it out of the east. It's a lot tougher than making it out of the Midwest. That's why you have good recovery rates here. All right. So now we're going to talk about another thing, and this is something that I've been working on recently, and it's in an attempt to understand how monarch populations grow. And I've been making a nuisance of myself by making a lot of predictions about how monarch populations are growing or not growing, and I've been pretty successful with it, because I'm using this, what I call stage-specific model. So I want to know what happens at the overwintering sites. I want to know how well they overwinter. I want to know how much overwintering mortality there is, and so on and so forth. I want to know how successful that spring return is. That second line there, when they're coming back from Mexico into Texas, I want to know how many are making it back, what their condition is, and so on and so forth. Then I want to know what the conditions are for the development of the first generation in that green area that I showed you on the map earlier. And I want to look at the recolonization of the northern states that takes place in May and early June as this first generation of butterflies moves up into that yellow area. And then I want to look at population growth through the summer, and that's highly dependent on temperature. So, and then of course we look at the fall migration as well. So if you look at these things, and you put all of these things together from year to year to year, you know, what the temperatures are in Texas, what the temperatures are in May, what the temperatures are in the summer, and you do that for a lot of years like I'm showing on this particular graph, it looks like a bunch of broken sticks. All right, you can have good conditions in March and April in Texas, and they could be followed by lousy conditions in May. Or it could be followed by a lousy summer temperatures. So basically, things go haywire more often than they go straight line. So what I'm looking for is those very few cases, and there are 3 shown here, and they're probably very hard to see, but where they go from positive, 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 the straight line. They're kind of going up here, and you can see, yeah, this is pretty much a straight line here. The second one, the third one's a straight line. That orange one's pretty much a straight line. Positive, positive, positive. And in all of those cases, the populations grew. Oh, wow, all right, that's a clue. All right, we've got to understand what makes a population grow, and it's this kind of a stage-specific thing. So what happened in this past year? Because you saw when I showed you that first figure of the populations, that this year's populations was 6.05 hectares, which was the biggest population we've seen since 2006, which is a long time ago. And I'm going, yeah, this is exactly what I predicted. I predicted that this was going to be a big population. My stage-specific model told me this was going to be a big population. Why? Because the timing of arrival was great. They came in good numbers. The March temperatures in Texas were above normal, but cold in northern Texas and Oklahoma. They couldn't get out of Texas. It was too cold for them to fly out of Texas until the very end of April. And by that time, most of them were dead. So what did that mean? It meant most of them laid their eggs in Texas. Most of them laid their eggs south of Dallas. And every day that they were doing that, every day I saw that cap on temperatures in North Texas, I'm cheering. I'm cheering, I'm going, yeah, this is going to be a big population. I could see that in March. Why? Because fundamental biology. High temperatures, larvae develop really fast, pupae develop fast, adults mature fast, generation time is short, all right? Age to first reproduction is short, all right? That's good, right? Because age to first reproduction is a principle of all sorts of population growth. You want to have the shortest age for first reproduction to maximize population growth. We all know that human populations where teenagers are producing children grow really fast, right? Too fast. But if you get aging populations like the Japanese or parts of Eastern Europe or even in Russia, those populations are not producing enough offspring because they're delaying reproduction until they're in their late 20s or 30s. So I want to see monarchs have the shortest age to first reproduction. And that's exactly what they did last year because those eggs were laid in Texas. So I'm going, mamas, lay your eggs in Texas. Mamas, keep your babies in Texas. We want Willie Nelson to come through with a song, Waylon Jennings, somebody, we need to talk to them as they come across the border. Anyway, we need to, so there's an optimal egg distribution. This is what this and other research told me. And we saw that this past spring. Now, the year before, in 2017, the butterflies were not limited by cold weather and kept in Texas. And they moved all the way up into Nebraska by the 10th of April. And I get a call from a friend in Nebraska after they arrived and said they came in here and they laid all sorts of eggs. Yeah, I mean, this is a month ahead of time. And they froze, right? And in Lawrence, Kansas, they came in on the 9th of April and they laid a lot of eggs, and I tracked the development. And it took them 45 days to reach maturity from the time the eggs were laid until the time the adults emerged. Now, if those eggs had been laid in Texas on the 9th of April, it would have taken them 30 days. So as these females spread their eggs out further north, they are diminishing the capacity for the population to grow. And the problem that we have is the temperatures are getting warmer in the south in March and April, and those populations are expanding further and further north early in the spring, too early in the spring for optimal population growth. So that's one of the negatives. So anyway, the bottom line was everything was good last year. I mean, everything worked out. It was positive, 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 positive. And I knew it was going to be a big population just on the basis of that sort of thinking. All right, now Texas March temperatures are changing. It's getting warmer and warmer, and that's not a good thing. We also know that droughts are coming in the future, and that's not going to be a good thing. So what we've seen is that monarch populations decline every time, almost 8 out of 10 times when the March temperature is well above normal in Texas. And the population increases 4 out of 4 times when the populations are below normal. Woo! That's keeping your eggs in Texas, right? All right. So, all right, getting back to one of the points I was making earlier in this talk, and that is that we have to be aware of what's happening on a yearly basis. We're losing about 1 million acres of grassland a year. And that is monarch habitat, ground nesting bird habitat, pollinator habitat, small mammal habitat, birds of prey habitat, you know, the whole thing, the whole shebang. We're losing a lot of habitat out there just because land conversion of one sort or another. And then we're losing about 1 million acres due to development. So if we are going to keep up with monarchs, we really have to understand that rate of loss. All right, well, why are monarchs declining? You're right in the middle of it here. You're right in the middle of a revolution in agriculture in which herbicide-tolerant plants have been developed and introduced and widespread. You're in the corn and soybean area, and starting in the late 1990s, but really taking off in the mid or early 2000s, herbicide corn and soybeans were rapidly adopted by the agriculture community, and I don't blame them. I probably would have too. I wrote to that point in 2004. 2004, I got an email. I received an email from a farmer in Nebraska, and he said that he was adopting these new technologies, these new seed lines, and he was using glyphosate or Roundup to treat those plants to eliminate the weeds in his row crops, and the effect of that was to eliminate milkweed, and he was eliminating monarch butterflies from his farm, and he wanted me to know that. And I'm going, oh my God, you know, this is the start of a real downturn. Well, Monarch Watch wasn't very solvent at that particular time, and it took us a while to get our things together, but in 2005, as a result of that email, we started the Monarch WAYSTATION program to recognize that habitat is decreasing and we needed to do something about it. But there are also the economics of the biofuels, and the biofuels, that was a thing that was started in 2007. President Bush decided that renewable fuel standard thing at the end of 2007, and that resulted in the conversion of rangeland and grassland to croplands for the production of those biofuels. So, you know, all of these things kind of conspired to generate a lot of habitat loss, and I'm not going to go through all of the details here, but here's a picture showing you what you used to be able to see in corn and soybeans field. This happened to be a soybean field, and you would see these bunches of milkweeds in there. They weren't throughout the entire field, but there are just enough of them per acre, so that in the year 2000, colleagues did a study of the most productive habitats for monarch butterflies, and it turned out to be cornfields. What? Cornfields. Cornfields were producing more monarch butterflies per acre than anything else. And then roadsides and pastures and you know, recovered land of one sort or another. And you know, as a result of this change in agriculture and the intensification of agriculture, we began to see this relationship, which was that as you get this adoption rate going way up, on this orange line here, you could see the monarch population going down. So the cause and effect, you know, it's not a perfect sort of relationship. It's not a one-to-one. You're dealing with the environmental variation as well. But it looked like there was a clear relationship between the loss of milkweed in these row crops and the loss of monarch butterflies. And then we had the data that came in from the renewable fuel standard studies that took place later. And here's a paper by a gentleman by the name of Lark, who was then a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. And he showed that of the croplands that were produced in 2008 to 2012, a 4-year period, that 77% of that was grassland. Well, that's pollinator, ground nesting bird, monarch habitat. So we lost a lot of habitat there. And this shows you where these blue areas are. It shows you where this land conversion took place. So basically what happened in the upper Midwest is the grains moved out of the upper Midwest and were replaced by corn, and the grains actually moved out into the grasslands. So you had this shift, and the shift was so fast and so intense and so mind-boggling that the people who were managing or monitoring landscape change were just kind of caught off guard. So it took about 4 years before people were actually aware of how much change had been occurring. But the effect of this was to really reduce the habitat available for monarch butterflies. Well, I'm not going to go through all of these numbers with you here, especially you can't see them in the back of the room anyway, but the bottom line here is that through all of these factors, and it's really hard to estimate this, and there's certainly no ultimate accuracy here, but there's an estimate, and the estimate is that we've lost amount of habitat that is almost equivalent to the state of Texas. Wow. No wonder the population is down. All right, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do in general about what's been changing out there? Well, if you look at this figure, and this figure is really widespread. If Doug Tallamy was here, he probably showed you this figure too. But if you look way over there to the left, it shows you what your turf grasses do. The turf grasses are very shallow rooted, right? The native plants are deeply rooted. Some of the native plants have roots that go down 20 feet. What does that mean? It means that they're very resistant to climate change. It means that they're very resistant to drought. And we've got to get them back in the landscape. So the number one thing in terms of restoring pollinators and monarch butterflies and so on is that we really have to get the natives back in there. We have to get these deep-rooted plants back in there. We have pretty much ignored this. And so when I work in Oklahoma, I honestly can't believe how difficult it is to find stands of native plants. I'm working with tribes in Oklahoma. We're trying to help them with habitat restoration. To do that, we have to collect seeds of native plants. And then we have to process them and teach them how to grow them out and so on and so forth. But even to find the native plants to harvest seed from is hard because that area has been so ravaged by agriculture, by overgrazing, by fires, by plowing and what have you. And I'm going, wow, this is a major task to get these native plants back there. When I first went to Oklahoma in 2015 to start working on this project, there were no cattle anywhere. Huge areas of pasture, no cattle. I said, where the heck are all the cattle? Well, it had 3 years of drought. 3 years of drought, and they'd sold all their cattle off. Because everything was so shallow rooted that they couldn't produce hay, they had no forage, they had to sell them off. So there are remedies for this, and the remedies for this are to get a lot more native plants out there in those pastures, do rotational grazing, do things that these people have not been doing in order to sustain their pastures and have some more resilience in the system. All right, working with tribes, that's a little concept that we have down here. We're working with the Eastern Shawnee tribes and 7 other tribes down in Oklahoma. And we have the kind of an island or patch concept about how to reestablish habitat. We create these little islands out there. We just would basically go in and nuke them with glyphosate and remedy. And then so that everything is dead in there. We might have to do it a couple of times. And then we go in there and densely plant forbs and overseed with grasses so that we get a dense stand of native plants. As those plants mature at the end of the year and they're all full of seed, then we mow it down and we mow all the surrounding areas. The idea of that is that the mowers will spread the seed. Spread the seed so we increase the effectiveness of each of these patches. This is the concept. This is what you can do with a little amount of money. You don't have a lot of money to restore all of these habitats. You want to restore 50 acres. Do it with patches rather than do it with trying to restore all 50 acres. It's easier. Plants are put in. This is a milkweed plant that grows in that area. Put it in, surround it with clean straw so that it's mulched a little bit, survives really well, and the next summer, this is what you get. Next spring, monarch caterpillars all over them. Proof of concept. It works. All right. All right. I'm involved with a number of other things. I wrote a white paper in 2015, which was for some reason that escapes me right now, was posted to our blog at 4:22 in the morning. But anyway, I do strange things at 4:22 in the morning. I guess there's people who know me understand. I guess they get emails from me at weird hours. But anyway, the idea was to create a Monarch highway. And that highway would be first off, it would be the I-35 highway. And the idea of this is that we have a milkweed monarch corridor that runs down the center part of the country. And if we populate that with habitats, and this is showing one of these habitats being created near Guthrie, Oklahoma. We get out there with a couple of augers. We bring in the plugs for the native plants, and we put them in there. These are about 10 inches apart. Put the plugs in from the native perennials, and that's planted like that. You get a bunch of volunteers to put these plants in each of these sites. These are pretty small sites. Had about 2,000 plants put in them. And kind of the fascinating thing for us when we were doing this is that this whole area is basically a sea of grass. And you could hardly see a flower anywhere. But when we put those plants out there on the side of the cement here before putting them into this plot, within an hour they were covered with pollinators. And Anne, who was my major assistant here in the red shirt, I remember her picking up a particular flat and flowering plants and walking it into the center of this plot and being followed by about 20 pollinators. I'm going, wow, she's got them trained. She's good, yeah, she's got them trained. All right, so we overseed with side oats grama and blue grama. These are small non-competitive grasses that kind of fill in the spaces that keep invading species from getting in there. And then we have a plot that is right next to the governor's mansion in Kansas, which shows a kind of high density effect. All they do to maintain this plot is cut it back every fall. They don't have to do any weeding or anything of this sort. The plants are perennials, so they just keep coming up and so on and so forth. So you just have to have them get out of their way. This is this proof of concept I was talking about. We have pollinators all over these plants before we actually got them in the ground. All right, so this is the idea. Creating a monarch highway will strongly communicate the need to maintain the integrity of the system that supports monarchs, pollinators, and other species sharing these habitats. And you know what? We need to do the same for ourselves, right? We need to maintain the system that maintains us. That's a message that we all have to get out to our fellow citizens. We can't ignore this system that is sustaining us. So this is a Monarch Highway official sign on I-35. We have KDOT, Kansas Department of Agriculture, has put in a couple of, or Department of Transportation has put in a couple of sites, and they look pretty good. This is our sign for our Monarch WAYSTATION program, which we created in 2005, and we now have over 23,000 registered Monarch WAYSTATIONs. And the thing that just kind of blew me away when I asked Jim, my assistant, to put this together was the fact that we have a whole bunch of international sites. I mean, we have 9 Canadian provinces represented. We have Mexico, and we have the Bahamas, Australia, India, and Peru. And I'm going, wow, all right, this thing is catching on all the way to India, all right? Okay, that shows that this is really old. It's a lot denser now and a lot more widespread than that. So this goes back to 15. Anyway, if you're doing this sort of thing, it helps to have good signage. We can help with signage if you're interested in getting some help with signage about the monarch gardens, pollinator gardens, and so on and so forth. Another program I started, which is called the Bring Back to Monarchs program, and the idea of this program is to restore the habitats for 20 different species of milkweeds from all over the country. And what we do to work with this is to get seeds from all of these milkweeds from all the different regions of the country that we can. And then we distribute these seeds to nurseries. We have 4 nurseries we work with. And we tell these nurseries, I want you to produce 2,000 plants for this particular ecoregion from these seeds that came from this ecoregion. And I want you to produce 5,000 plants for this ecoregion from these seeds that came from that ecoregion. So we have all of these kind of directives that we give these nurseries. We've been distributing about 150,000 plants a year through this program. Probably this year we'll probably hit 1 million plants total since we started this. So that's a start, and it's the biggest program of this kind in the country right now, and it's nothing compared to what's needed. You know, now you're talking 5 years and you're talking 1 billion plants, or 6 years and 1 million plants, and we're talking about getting 1.4 billion out there. No, this is a big job ahead. So we work with nurseries that really know how to produce milkweeds. This is a nursery in Kansas. It's right close to us. We have other nurseries in Texas, Florida, and California that we work with. We produce really nice plugs. They're about 3.5 months old. They have a really good chance of surviving. They're extremely well rooted. So let's talk about the Monarch Recovery Plan. We'll move on to a kind of a different subject here. Talk about what really needs to be done. And Angela has not given me the hook yet, so I'm going to go through this. Am I all right? All right?
I'm poking you.
You're poking me? All right. I'll go fast. All right. Keep some of you awake. All right. So we have capacity issues. Do we have the capacity to do what I'm talking about? And are we going to be able to increase production of milkweeds, forbs, and grass seeds for these restoration projects? Are we going to be able to produce the appropriate regional seed mixes for seeding restoration? And are we going to be able to identify and get agreement to restore a lot of these sites? And are we going to be able to engage in all of the outreach that we need to get landowners involved? You know, that's going to take money. It's going to take a lot of effort. And, you know, to get this all done, it's going to take a lot of boots on the ground, and it's going to take a lot of money. Well, I think you understand all of that. Anyway, for implementation, you need a management plan, you need marketing and outreach, and you need all of these other sorts of things. But we need to basically, you know, it's all hands on deck. We need to get everybody involved as we possibly can. So engagement is the byword here for all of the different sectors of the community that can help out. Now, let's talk about outcome. I told you earlier that we're talking about annual losses of maybe 1 million acres of grassland, another annual loss of maybe a million acres of habitat due to development. And this comes down to, you know, one of my favorite sort of things that I point out to people, that the Red Queen, you know, and Alice in Wonderland, I don't guess most of you remember what the Red Queen said to Alice, but when Alice was wondering about her status and how things were in terms of staying where she was, Red Queen told her, you know, Alice, if you want to stay in one place, you have to run as fast as you can. And if you want to get anywhere else, you have to run twice as fast as that. Wait a minute. Well, that's where we are, whether we like it or not. To actually deal with monarch conservation, we have to run as fast as we possibly can just to stay in one place, to keep from losing ground on a yearly basis. That means that we have to restore at least 2 million acres a year before we're going to gain on this problem. Have to run as fast as we can, and have to run twice as fast as that. All right. Tough, 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 tough. We're going to do it? So we have to have a vision. We have to offset those annual losses. That has to be our first goal. And then we have to develop the capacity to move beyond that. All right, particularly in this area that's most contributing to this overwintering number. And then I talk a lot about multiplier effect, because multiplier effects are kind of important for motivating people. You want to have something that stands out in terms of getting people to pay attention. You want to have successes, and you want to advertise all those successes. You want to point out that you've got proof of concept here, proof of concept there. This thing works. And you want to have it backed by really solid data, right? So nobody can question it. You don't want to just fake it. It's got to be the real thing. And once you get the real thing out there and people can see the benefits of what you're trying to propose, it's going to multiply. That's what we have to work at. All right, last thing I'm going to talk about is the Endangered Species Act and the petition that's before the Department of Interior. There's a petition before the Department of Interior to declare the monarch butterfly threatened. This petition was brought by the Center for Food Safety, the Center for Biological Diversity, Xerces Society and Lincoln Brower, who unfortunately is now deceased. The idea of this was that we really had to declare it threatened to protect this population due to what happened in 2013 with that extraordinarily small population. So a decision is going to be made in June of this year to determine whether monarchs should be declared threatened or not. And the problem with having it declared threatened is that there is a fear of regulation. Landowners fear that if monarch is protected in some way, that they're not going to be able to manage their lands the way they want to. And there have been a number of cases like this in the history of endangered and threatened species, and it's created this sort of a category of landowner or participant, candidate conservation agreements with assurances. What that means is that if you sign up to manage your land in a certain way that is consistent with the goals of conservation for a given species, and you do this through time, that you're not going to be regulated. And so the idea is to have a lot of people step up and become involved in these, we call them CCAAs, become involved in these, so that should the monarchs become declared threatened, that they would be protected. All right, so that's the proposition. So that's where we're at. We're kind of on a cliff's edge here in terms of whether the monarchs are going to be declared threatened or not. I happen to think they're not going to be declared threatened. I think the population has shown quite a bit of resilience. There's quite a bit of activity out there to try to create habitat. Even though it's not up to my standard of 2 million acres a year, there's an effort. And I think that effort is going to be important in swaying the Department of Interior not to declare monarchs threatened. So what I'm urging everybody to do is to get through this particular effort to have it declared threatened with as little acrimony as possible, because we're going to be back at this table again. Because even if it's not threatened now, it's likely that somewhere in the next 10 years it will be threatened, because climates are changing, things are changing. We are also dealing with another threat, which I haven't mentioned so far, and that is the Pacific is warming up. And when the Pacific warms up, particularly in the wintertime, masses of warm air come in off the Pacific, and they come through the central highlands of Mexico. As that mass of warm air rises in the mountains, it comes down as precipitation, either as rain or as snow or as sleet or as corn snow or something of that sort. We've had 4 killing events since 2002 due to these masses of air coming in off the Pacific in the dry season in Mexico. So that's not going to change. That's probably going to get worse. So ultimately, monarchs are facing a lot of different threats. There are threats of habitat loss, threats of overwintering security, threats of getting too warm in there, pushing the trees further and further up the mountains. You know, again, to address this problem, we have to deal with approximate things, but we also have to convince our fellow citizens that, hey, it's more than monarchs. It's more than monarchs. While we can use monarchs as a kind of a flagship for what we need to do, it's a flagship for really how to sustain the habitats that sustain us. That's what we need to think about. All right. Well, there's my last picture. This is a picture taken by Pete Berthelsen, who is into habitat restoration. He's a friend of mine from Nebraska. He used to be responsible for putting about 1 million acres of habitat in the ground when he was working for Pheasants Forever. Now he's formed his own company. And this is just a really nice sunset, and it just reminds me to tell everybody, let's not let the sun set on the monarch migration. Thank you very much.